Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Holger Klein. I am the director of the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies. And I am glad that our speaker today, Professor Ryan Gingeras, who is a professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School, is here with us in a virtual format. We had scheduled his lecture for last spring, and like so many events, we had to cancel it due to the unfolding COVID crisis. So we are particularly happy that he is joining us today in this virtual format, which gives many more people a chance to listen to him than we would have been able to fit into a Columbia lecture hall. We are therefore most grateful to Professor Gingeras to switch format, and hopefully we will be able to invite him another time in person when that is possible again. Today's lecture is co-sponsored by the Sakıp Sabancı Center and the Columbia Department of History. And I would like to thank both Adam Costo, the current chair of the History Department, and Professor Tunç Şen for working with us to host Professor Gingeras' lecture today. I will turn the podium over to Professor Şen in a second so that he can properly introduce Ryan Gingeras. But before I do so, I would like to extend my thanks again to the staff of the History Department and the Sakıp Sabancı Center, and especially to Sharon for working behind the scenes, both now and for doing so with all the travel arrangements that we made in the spring. I would also like to thank everybody in the audience for joining us today and to encourage you to join us for the question and answer session after Professor Gingeras' talk. If you want to participate in the Q&A and you would like to ask a question, please at that time raise your blue Zoom hand so that we can establish an order of questions, and we will take your question in the order that we receive them. You can also use the chat function in Zoom if you want to communicate general comments that are not questions for the Q&A. We will share that with Professor Gingeras after his talk so that he can also respond to comments that you might have that are more intricate or are not questions for the Q&A. So without further ado, let me turn the podium over to my colleague, Professor Şen. And thank you again for joining us to today's lecture.
Thank you very much, Professor Klein, for this introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Tunç Şen. I'm an assistant professor at the History Department and also a member of the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies Executive Committee. We are particularly delighted to host Professor Ryan Gingeras today, albeit virtually. As Professor Klein has just mentioned, Professor Gingeras is a professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School. He is an expert on Turkish, Balkan, and Middle East history, and the author of 5 books, including most recently Eternal Dawn, Turkey in the Age of Atatürk. And I assume today's talk will be closely related to his most recent book. His Sorrowful Shores, Violence, Ethnicity, and the End of the Ottoman Empire received shortlist distinctions for the Rothschild Book Prize in Nationalism and Ethnic Studies and the British Kuwait Friendship Society Book Prize. He has also published on a wide variety of topics related to Turkish, Balkan, and Middle East history and politics in such journals and publications as Past and Present, International Journal of Middle East Studies, Foreign Affairs, New York Times, Middle East Journal, Iranian Studies, and War on the Rocks. As this long list reveals, Professor Gingeras is one of the most prolific historians of his generation. So without further ado, I'm just leaving the floor to Professor Gingeras.
Thank you so much, Şen. Thank you so much, Holger, for the invitation. It's really great to be here with you, even if it's virtual. And thank you all for showing up, whether it's morning time, the afternoon. For those of you who are tuning in from Turkey in evening time, I really appreciate it, especially all of you in Turkey. I would be in bed by now. So, you know, it's really flattering and it's an honor to be with you all. May I just ask am I able to share my screen? I am? Okay. All righty. Okay. Did everybody see this? Okay, great. All right. So I'm going to try to be as expeditious as possible getting through this presentation so we can get more to question and answer. But just from the top, let me say, what I want to do today is address something that is kind of represents a kind of broader slice of my most recent book on the age of Ataturk's rule in Turkey, the establishment of the Turkish Republic. And I designed this talk primarily to kind of give all of you a sense of the kind of topics I talk about and the ways in which, the material, specifically the resource material, at least some of it I use in the book is used to tell this wider story. So what I want to do today is primarily talk about sort of broader sets of conclusions or insights related to a relatively narrow set of documents found within the archives of the Prime Minister's office related to the Republic of Turkey. And these are the records of the Republican People's Party. And in particular, what I want to do today is look at and talk a little bit about what these records reveal about the way in which at least one element of the Turkish government understood local elites, specifically sort of certain kinds of challenges posed by local elites, and also talk about the ways in which these records speak to challenges seen within broader society, specifically the kind of resistance or sort of incompatibility within society vis-a-vis what we'll be talking about today as the sort of the Kemalist revolution, or the revolution brought about by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Now, let me say up front that, again, this is something that reflects my sort of a broad cross-section of what I address in my book. And I should say that, my book doesn't really try to reinvent the wheel when it comes to the telling of the story of the foundation of the Republic of Turkey in the reign of Mustafa Kemal. I mean, I'd like to think that, broadly speaking, one thing it tries to do is survey and distill what I think is, has been a pretty rich, couple of years of research. In recent years, there's been quite a bit of attention that's been given to this period, in part due to sort of not only greater interest, but greater access to archival material in Turkey. And I think that a lot of this research has really begun to change the way we think about this period. But I don't think there really hasn't been a book up until now that I think gives, the kind of attention a lot of these more recent works do to, specific aspects of this period of time. Now, this book is in some ways a kind of continuation of what I've done in the past. I think one thing that ties all of my work together is sort of my general interest in the transition between the Ottoman Empire and the beginning of the post-imperial period, be it in Turkey or in the Balkans or elsewhere. Now, this book isn't just sort of generally, wasn't conceived simply as a kind of textbook. It does pose two, I think, relatively conservative arguments, related to this period of time. Okay, and the first one is that it tries to tell the story of the years in which Ataturk rules over Turkey within the context of transition from empire to nation state. In particular, that the reforms, the manner of government that the Republic of Turkey institutes post-1923, in many ways, not totally, but in many ways, represents a continuation of reforms that begin during the late Ottoman period. Now, that would also include intellectually, and this is something I'm not going to talk about too much today, but one thing I tried to do is try to pull apart the ways in which the Kemalist reforms was a collaborative effort and reflected the ideas and the input and the energies of individuals in and beyond just Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Okay, and many of these are people who have actually quite rich careers as intellectuals and writers going back to the late Ottoman period. Now, the second element of this book, and this is something that really is kind of at the forefront of what I'll be talking about today, is understanding this period of time as a period of revolution. And this is, I don't mean so much as an analytical or a kind of polemical way, but really this is the ways in which, Ataturk and those who formed around him thought about this period of time themselves while they were, living it, and while they were trying to piece together what the culture, the politics of this young republic is, and that what they were bringing about, what they were experiencing was a revolution. So, one thing that this book tries to do is try to present this revolution not only in terms of its achievements, but also in terms of the limits of the revolution, some of its failures, but also include many of its tragedies and its atrocities that came with the institution of this republic and the institution of this revolution. Okay, so that brings me to sort of just generally, and I imagine many of you sort of with me today are quite familiar with this period, quite familiar with the history of this period, but realizing also that there may be some of you who are maybe not as familiar with this period, or perhaps not as familiar with many of the works that precede my own book. Let me just simply say, first and foremost, that again, it is my book is very much indebted to a long series of works that precede it. Okay, as many of you know, the period of Ataturk's rule in Turkey from 1922-23 to 1938 is among the most not only important, but among the most embraced element of Turkish history. In many ways, it is the central focal point of historical education in Turkey, both today, but since the very beginning of the Republic itself. Now, interestingly, though, I mean, even though one can find a great many works related to this period of time, there are aspects of this history that still remain relatively understudied. There's a lot about this period we don't know. And this gets into the issue of the challenges of trying to study this period, of which there are many. Among them is that historically, this is a history that has been told from the point of view of state authorities, the narrative being very much policed and approved by state authorities. And so there is a long history of censorship and self-censorship within the telling of this chapter of history, as well as sort of the deeper ideological elements that are often married to this history. In many ways, the telling of this history is not simply about reliving or understanding what happened in the past. It's about imparting really important ideological principles that are become central to Turkish citizenship. So in many ways, that has helped really hem in the nature of this history from the very beginning. Another element of this too are the arguably the sort of the taboos that are related to this period of time, and many of the of the sort of imagined or very real risks scholars and students take in questioning this this history. There is a really rather long and rather sad history of government attempts to try to suppress publications that challenge this history. There is much more sort of even kind of a broader history of people sort of being a little bit more demure in questioning the history for fear of being ostracized or being penalized, formally or informally in another way. And then there's the issue of sources, and this is something that again will kind of be one of the focal points of this talk today. And that we have only very, very, very recently, really only in the last 20 years, have had access to, among the few really rich primary source materials available in Turkey today, and that is the state archives. And it should be said, I mean, I can talk about this in greater detail in the Q&A, but really only a fraction of this, of the available source material is accessible to researchers, and among them are the files that I'll be talking about today. Now, and I will say right up front that I'm by no means the first person who's ever addressed the nature of these materials. There are others who have done so, quite expertly in many ways, much more than I'm going to do so today. People like Yiğit Akın, Murat Metinsoy, and others have talked about these files. But again, the spirit of my talk here is to try to survey more broadly what the book, it tries to accomplish by talking about, both the revelations and the challenges that the source materials pose to us today. Okay, so let's dive into the topic. Now, again, the benefit of this slide is mostly for those of you here in the audience who are perhaps not as familiar with this history as perhaps others. Now, again, this is a rather sort of intricate topic. I don't want to sort of spend too much time about how I come to think about or define this period of time in terms of it being a period of revolution, but suffice to say, for at least the moment, that to understand this period of time, that is again between 1922, 1923 to 1938, those who led the Turkish Republic, not simply Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founding president, but its leading ideologues, the critical supporters in the press, everyday citizens thought about and embraced this period of time as an era of revolution. And it was an era of revolution geared towards the total transformation of Turkish society, Turkish state, even sort of intellectually what it meant to be Turkish. And it took many different forms. And again, I'm not going to do justice to them all today. Ones I really want to sort of focus on today instead are the principles of identity that are really quite critical to the ways in which Ataturk and those around him sought to change, modernize, transform Turkish society. Now, among the elements of identity that this revolution sought to address is the idea of inculcating Turkish citizens with a much more coherent, relatively uncompromising notion of being Turkish. Being Turkish being something that is not simply a national designation, but one that represented also understanding Turkishness as a kind of race consciousness, something more than simple ethnic consciousness. The language of race is really quite important ultimately to the ways in which the government of this period of time tried to instill people a sense of being Turkish and belonging to the Turkish nation. The other element of this is the notion of language. Now, I'm sure as many of you know in the audience, this is a period in which the Turkish language is radically transformed as a result of government fiat. Okay, it is not only transformed in terms of imposing a new alphabet upon the language, doing away with the old Ottoman alphabet that had been used for everyday Turkish, but also a radical transformation of the grammar and the vocabulary of the Turkish language. Okay, stripping it of quote unquote foreign words, infusing it with new words that were to represent quote unquote more Turkish native expressions or origins, but also ones that were deemed much more modern. Okay, now married to this as well is both the issue of secularism as it pertains to one's identity, but also to the institution of the Turkish government, Turkish education, as well as even the practice of primarily Islam itself. Okay, and again, this is a much worked over topic, one that I'm not going to do total justice to today, but suffice to say that when we talk about secularization, we're talking about both the idea that Islam as a matter of practice, as well as it is a matter of performance, let's say, in terms of the way in which people actually go about being a Muslim. This becomes comes almost completely under state supervision, under state authority, as well as the state's desire to challenge or do away with certain taboos or certain values that were deemed reactionary, unmodern, too conservative. Okay, I mean, perhaps among the more visible of this is the so-called hat law, the mandating that that individuals wear hats with brims as opposed to, say, turbans or fezzes. Okay, and that this was something that was deemed both an issue that was important for the revolutionary values of the country, but also the matter of identity. It was a way of trying to, to transform the way in which people relate themselves to Islam. Okay. All right. Now, this revolution that I've kind of just briefly summarized, the nature of it was imposed through a number of different instruments. Okay. Among the most important, and this is especially the case by the 1930s, among the most important was the governing party, the Republican People's Party. And by the way, please forgive me if I put the apostrophe in the wrong place. I can never figure out whether the apostrophe goes, I always forget whether it goes before the S or after the S. So please don't think less of me if I got it wrong. Anyway, now, the Republican People's Party is established shortly after the so-called War of Independence, the war that is fought by the remnants of Ottoman forces between 1919 and 1922. Okay. Now, in the 1930s, it becomes not simply Turkey's sole mass party. Okay. It becomes an extension of the government itself, and in many ways it takes a kind of role similar to other revolutionary parties we see during the interwar period, be it the fascists in Italy, the Nazis in Germany, or the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union. Now, it's very clear, and this is something that historians have meditated upon quite a bit over the last 20 or more years, is that the Republican People's Party in many ways is a continuation, or perhaps more accurately, a reimagination of a party that had preceded it, the Committee of Union and Progress, which governed to varying degrees the Ottoman Empire from 1908 to 1918. Now, it should be said that large elements of the Republican People's Party, particularly at the top, were members of this party. And so in many ways, a lot of the lessons that they learned about government and a lot of their ideological biases come from their time as members of the CUP, or as the times in which they were more colloquially called Young Turks. Okay. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing, because I would say that the CUP and the Republican People's Party, the RPP, are actually quite different institutionally. The CUP arguably was never really designed as a mass party. It was actually designed as something quite different. Again, sort of, this is somewhat of a rabbit hole. I don't want to kind of go down this hole too far, but suffice to say that even though there's a great deal of borrowing from this previous party by members of the RPP, it is institutionally quite different. It functioned quite different, especially vis-a-vis the nature of government. At times, the CUP was something that was quite separate from government, and at various points, it was virtually the offices of this party were indistinguishable from the imperial government. And there are other times where the linkages were much more nebulous, much more personalized. And so that we're talking about, again, something that is, is some ways a carryover, but also, the RPP is something that is very unique and very much speaks to the era of the 1930s, an era of mass revolution, radical efforts to nationalize and transform societies in doing so through mass parties. Okay. Now, when we think about the RPP as an element of government, okay, there is a lot that I think we still need to understand. Okay, as I referenced before, the documents that we're going to be talking about today are documents that primarily come from the 1930s. We don't really know. I would argue, and hopefully I maybe stand corrected at some point. We don't really know a lot about the nature of this party institutionally, organizationally, from the 1920s until about 1930s. And this is largely because of, as I'll talk about, because of a certain degree of crisis in the Republic of Turkey beginning in 1930. One of the way we also don't know, more specifically about the development of this party is the way in which the party saw itself as, being somewhat akin to other mass parties in Europe. Okay, we know, especially through the press, that that senior leaders of the RPP followed events in Italy and in Germany and the Soviet Union. We know that senior leaders of the RPP had various degrees of affection for these mass parties. They even had personal experience within these various revolutionary states during the interwar period. We don't necessarily know the degree to which there is a direct influence in the ways in which the party itself developed. And so, for example, one sort of little bit of evidence that we see of a certain degree of osmosis is the period of time in the late 1920s in which fascist Italy and Mustafa Kemal's Turkey began to grow a great deal closer. And so we actually see various degrees of exchanges between representatives of the fascist, of the Italian fascists and the RPP going back and forth between Italy and Turkey. Okay. Now, having said that, I mean, one thing that we definitely have a strong understanding, especially from the documents as we read them now today, is that members of the RPP looked and understood their role as successors of empire. They were functionaries in a state that had taken over from not only a government that was imperial, but from a culture that was much more diverse, syncretic, in some ways, culturally speaking, in terms of ideas of identity, quite antithetical to the sort of regime that they were trying to bring about. Okay, and so one of the elements of this party was to try to understand, or one of the goals of this party was not only to try to govern, but also to understand the nature of provincial society in Turkey. And this is something that we see, going on internally within other revolutionary states of this period of time. I mean, I think perhaps the most visible being the Soviet Union, where the Bolsheviks, on the one hand, come to power as the liberators of small peoples of various nationalities from Soviet Russian imperial rule, but in many ways take the place of old imperial officials and even sort of utilize elements of the old imperial, of old imperial practices in order to understand, in order to govern the diverse landscape of the Soviet Union. Okay. Now, so let me sort of get into sort of the first of what I would say is sort of two prongs of this talk, or there's two main, narrow issues I'd like to focus on. And that is the ways in which the Republican People's Party saw and understood provincial elites, be them within the party or outside of it. Now, I should say that the topic itself, or the drive to try to understand provincial elites, comes out of a series of crises that culminate in around 1930, 1931. The first of this, perhaps the most profound of which being the Great Depression, which really devastates the Turkish economy. The second being the outbreak of a very brief but rather dramatic rebellion in the western part of the country, the so-called Menemen incident, which was led by a leader of a local Sufi order, which resulted in not only the death of Turkish security personnel, but beheading of one of the detachment commanders sent to put down this brief outbreak of violence. And the third are the elections of 1930, in which, rather uniquely, Ataturk sanctioned the creation of a kind of loyal opposition party, a party that would hopefully provide a kind of outlet for provincial dissent and some degree of sort of driving sort of new blood in Ankara and sort of new ideas into Ankara. A step that turned out to be almost perceived from the inside out to be a kind of a disaster. That when the elections took place, this opposition party grew in size rather rapidly. It became a base for a great deal of provincial discontent that grew rather vocally. And in the sort of the backdrop of the so-called Menemen incident, it was seen perhaps as a potential vehicle for what was deemed as religious reaction within provincial Turkish society. And so after a very brief period of time after this election, this opposition party is closed down. It's closed down by the consent of its leaders. And so these three crises taken together led to a great deal of soul searching within Ankara and among Turkey's inner party elite in an effort to try to understand what went wrong, but also what perhaps was going wrong at the local level. And so this prompted the creation of several so-called inspectorates, various formal districts under in which the party would, party functionaries would oversee local affairs and also produce status reports on affairs related to the party and more broadly related to the state. And this occurs as the party is growing much more integrated into the state itself. By the mid-1930s, the Republican People's Party identifies itself as the state party. It is, Turkey is now a party state, in the words of its chairman, Recep Peker. Now, so what does this mean? What do these steps, mean with respect to understanding provincial society? Well, one thing that is very interesting about the reports produced by inspectors and that are channeled up through the chain of command within the Republican People's Party is that these inspectors are tasked with understanding, kind of the basic competency, the base of effectiveness of the party as a whole, and the kind of local leaders that represent the party. Now here, in terms of kind of the broader conclusions that we can draw, a lot of the things that you would find in these files reflect the kind of interests and exasperations that you find in any kind of government, any kind of organization. You find local functionaries who are competent or incompetent. You find local leaders who are very loyal and honest. We find those who are not. We find offices that are relatively well run. We find offices that are not, okay? Now, we also get, by the way, sort of parenthetically, some really interesting insights into the, backgrounds of certain local leaders. And we find this, and where we see this most detailed is in the western part of the country, specifically in Thrace and along the sort of the Aegean coast. These are also areas where this briefly formed opposition party, the Free Party, actually turned out to be rather popular. And so there was a great deal of sort of personal interest in the personnel in these local offices. So we get a really interesting sort of cross-section of who these people are. Now, with respect to sort of the nature of the revolution itself, we see a lot of interesting comments about some of the frustrations that these inspectors begin to sort of, encounter with respect to local elites and their willingness or their lack of willingness to toe the revolutionary line when it comes to issues of identity. Be it the fact that they didn't speak Turkish, the fact that they perhaps were relatively, religiously conservative or perhaps resisted certain secularizing reforms, or perhaps that they also were under the influence of local elites who were not members of the party and who really represented the older order, particularly the old Ottoman provincial order. So let me run through just a couple of quick examples of what this means, okay? And this is, by the way, to indulge all of you in the audience who speak Turkish, read Turkish, and are interested in kind of the sausage making of this project, okay? So here you see on your right a little bit of an excerpt from a report from Sinop on the north shore of Anatolia. And here we have an inspector who encounters sort of local representatives of the RPP, particularly attached to the Halkeve, the People's House, which was among the main cultural conduits of the party. And he finds that this, among the local leaders of the party are two people who are Circassian, or people of North Caucasian descent, people who came, either themselves or their parents as immigrants to Anatolia from the North Caucasus. Now, what's very interesting here is that these local leaders are actually quite competent and quite respected, and do not necessarily betray any sign that they see themselese or promote any notion that they are Circassian before they are Turkish. Okay, actually specifically says that these individuals do not speak Circassian, and they are not attached to Circassianness, guess meaning that they just weren't too upfront about being Circassian. Nonetheless, they were called Circassian. They were recognized as being Circassian, and that in itself was problematic, because the conceit of this revolution is that all Turks are Turks, and they are all Turks because they are biologically, they are culturally, they are linguistically Turkish. And so here we have two rather loyal party practitioners who are kind of violating one of the core elements of the revolution, identifying themselves or being identified in ways as not being Turkish. Now, I mean, what's interesting here is that this is one of the more, kind of paradoxical cases where we have local elites who are loyal and otherwise, true functionaries of the revolution, but who still maintain some element of what was sort of deemed to be kind of the older reactionary order of the Ottoman era of diversity and so on. Now, what we see actually is a great deal of evidence in which, local leaders or that, people who influence local leaders are actually quite reactionary and not at all hide their biases against these revolutionary principles. And so this is something that we see in various chapters of these files, okay? Let me give you a second example, not so much related to individuals, but related to regions. And I think this underscores a really core element that is, sort of a core example of the kind of, regional challenges the party confronts. Now, this is an excerpt from a broad survey of Erzurum in the eastern central part of the country. And, this, I should say, sort of, again, somewhat parenthetically, comes from one of the earlier files, which are a little bit less formulaic, a little bit more conversational, a little bit more anecdotal. As you look at the Republican People's files forward of the inspectorates, going forward towards the late 1930s, they become a little bit more formulaic. The language becomes a little bit more stunted. They're beginning to speak, let's just say, more Kemalist. I mean, they're a little bit less expressive and blunt in the way they characterize certain affairs. Now, here we have a rather bleak assessment of the region of Erzurum, both in terms of the city, its immediate county, but also the broader region. And what this passage essentially summarizes is the degree to which Erzurum hadn't really recovered from the First World War and events thereafter, despite a significant passage of time. Okay, and that significantly the population had dropped rather significantly. One assumes not only because of the fighting in the First World War, but also as a result of the Armenian genocide, the mass flight of Muslim refugees westward, and also the mass transport of certain groups from Erzurum, most notably Kurds, to the western part of the country. So what is left is really a kind of shell of itself in terms of the town and in terms of the population. The town is still rather wrecked. The region around it is, you know, heavily depopulated. And so as a result, these inspectors confront is a landscape that is very poor, little in the way of tax revenues. Public security is pretty bad, not necessarily, as they point out, in a political sense, but just in terms of raw banditry and lawlessness. But most interestingly, and this is where we get into the question of elites, there are really there's a chronic lack of staffing at the government level in various parts of Erzurum and really throughout the East as a whole. There are, you know, offices that don't have governors. There are gendarmerie offices that don't have commanders. There are whole sections of the provinces where there are no doctors, there are no engineers, there are no lawyers to staff the court. And so the very basic fabric of the state does not exist in large parts of the country. And that, interestingly, we don't see it here, but we see in many of these reports the problem of trying to maintain staff. Many of the staff that gets sent, that is assigned to eastern districts, many of them come from Ankara, they come from Istanbul, they come from the western part of Turkey. Many of them are young and they don't last long. They stay for a little while and then they go back because, after all, these are places that are rather poor, rather desolate, pretty remote, and in many cases pretty dangerous. So here, again, we get a really interesting, you know, sort of slice of the nature of provincial life, especially among elites, in this way. And there are many other revelations I could talk to, but these are just sort of two examples. Okay. Now, the second part of this I'd like to talk about with respect to these files and some of their revelations is what they talk, you know, is their specific approach towards elements of resistance, popular resistance to the reforms of the state. And that by the mid to late 30s, there is a formulaic questionnaire that is sent out to inspectors, asking them if there are any individuals or groups who are secretly trying to undermine or openly trying to undermine the state, be they, and this is, as you can see quoted here, classist, factionalist, regionalist, or internationalist. Now, the fascinating part of this is almost all their inspectors come back and say, no, there aren't any. Now, that is, however, often qualified by other anecdotes, okay? And the anecdotes are actually quite interesting and in many cases, very rich and very revealing. And what they reveal is something I'm sure, again, many of you who are students of this period would find to be rather expecting in large parts of the country. Now, there are large parts of the country, there are people who do not speak Turkish. They don't speak a word of it. There are large parts of people who don't identify themselves as being Turkish. There are large numbers of people in the country who are still, you know, sort of seen as being culturally or functionally reactionary, be they religious, you know, be they in a religious sense or in a nationalistic sense. And this not only includes nationalists, but this would also include non-Muslims, which are generally identified as being in themselves somewhat culturally problematic to the revolution. And so we get a really interesting set of kind of anecdotal insights in terms of what are the kind of you know, popular sources of resistance to the revolution in different areas. And so let me sort of share this one example with you. Now, this comes from a little bit later, a little bit outside the scope of the time frame we're talking about here from 1940, but one would assume that this would be true during the time of Ataturk's reign, that is sort of before 1938. And this is taken from the region of Dadaya, which is a part, you know, which is a small county in Sivas, and again, sort of in the east central part of the country. Now here, the reporting agent, you know, talks about the presence of really large numbers of Armenians living in this province. Now, in some ways, in many cases, inspectors talk about this as a problem unto itself, and that this, you know, that this group fundamentally challenges the nationalizing project of Turkey as a whole. But more specifically, the agent identifies the fact that these individuals operate as he describes it, parasites behaving parasitically towards the local population because of the fact that they were prominent in certain skilled trades, be as peddlers or as craftsmen. And even more insidiously, that this agent finds that there is nary a house in this district where there isn't a wife or slave of Armenian origin. Now here, I mean, I think this, I have to admit, is perhaps the most vivid and direct example of the kind of, sort of phenomena that we see, I think, broadly throughout Anatolia. And that is the sort of the after effects, or the enduring effects of the Armenian genocide. Not only the presence of survivors of the genocide, but the degree to which elements of what remained of Armenians in Turkey began to integrate, or were forcibly integrated into post-genocide society. And I think this example is highly representative of that. Okay, now let me give you one last example from these records with respect to popular resistance. And this is from the region of Bozkır in Konya, in the center of the country, a region that I should say that then and now is still kind of seen as a real throbbing heart of religious conservatism in Turkey. And here we see the case of a certain preacher and large landholder, a gentleman by the name of Abdülkadir. Now, Abdülkadir was, as the agent describes it, is a large landowner, somebody who has a great deal of influence among the local peasantry, but even much more sort of insidious, and I should say again, somewhat as a digression, it was generally believed that large landowners were a real problem, a real sort of institutional problem to the administration, and specifically, the institution of reformist change in the provinces. So, him being identified as being a quote unquote tyrant, using sort of the old Ottoman term of mutagalibe, which is a sort of deeply historical term for provincial tyrants. This is an individual who also is very much against the secularizing reforms of the Kemalist administration, and preaches about it widely. Now, what was particularly disturbing from the part of this agent is that he sees this person as being relatively free to do so. Local RPP and a local RPP administrator is tasked with trying to suppress his activities, and evidently he's not very successful at doing so. But more disturbing is the fact that he seems to be greeted by elements of the provincial administration. One of the anecdotes that is shared by an inspector is the fact that after giving a speech before a mosque in the town of Beyşehir, again in Konya, the local governor comes and greets him and embraces him, congratulates him on the talk, and helps him raise money for his trouble. So here, I mean, this is again sort of reflective of both kind of popular resistance, but also sort of again the challenge of local elites that are being talked about within these pages. Okay, so I'm going to wind up here and say that the significance of these reports, by and large, give a very strong sense of the degree to which local agents, but also probably sort of more senior officials within the government and within the party itself, understood that there were limits to the revolution. They understood that despite the boisterousness with which they herald a lot of these changes, a lot of the changes provincially were skin deep, if not completely invisible to the naked eye. And that they understood that the state in reality had a great deal of work to do to try to transform the society. And there were sort of solutions that were broached within many of these reports, which I can talk about in the Q&A, but they understood that the degree to which this project transforming society was something that was going to need a great deal of time, as well as a great deal of attention and greater effectiveness on the part of the administration, these were things that had to be known and had to be reckoned with internally. I should actually say that, I've kind of left out, who oftentimes within this period is the main character of the story, which is Ataturk himself. Now, what is very clear is Ataturk in the 1930s, as one scholar more affectionately put it, Ataturk in this period of time is somewhat semi-retired. He is, at least from the pages of these files, he's rather absent. And these are affairs that are being broached. They are being surveyed and overseen by his surrogates. Whether it's the party chairman, local provincial leaders, and so forth. He's relatively absent, but that doesn't mean he's not important. And I'll conclude with this. This is an anecdote that you see repeated in a number of different venues, but I think it's one that's really quite, kind of sentimental in that it's found within the pages of these files. And this comes from a local party congress in the town of Kütahya, in the sort of central western part of Anatolia. And here the inspector asks this small town official rather bluntly, do you understand what the Republic is? And he says, matter-of-factly, yes, the Republic is the Gazi Pasha. It is Ataturk. And that is fundamentally what it appears this period is about from large numbers of people throughout Turkey. What these changes incurred was really the changes that come about during this period of time. The imposition of this new state is really about the ascendancy, the importance, the centrality of the character of Ataturk himself. Okay, so that concludes my talk. I thank you all for your patience and your attention, and I'll take whatever questions anybody has.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for this really instructive and interesting presentation. I'll be moderating the Q&A session now. We have over 30 minutes. So if any of our audience would like to raise a question, please raise your hand and I'll give the podium to you. Let me just, Nora Fisher.
Hi, thank you so much for this very interesting talk. It's early in the morning here in California, and you've got me off to a good day. I wanted to ask, so I'm fascinated by, the traces of things that are spoken and unspoken, which you're able to find in these materials. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole sort of strand of kind of, post single party area historiography that kind of talks about the way that nostalgia for Ottoman Empire, Ottoman Islamic glory was suppressed during the single party period. And that this was kind of induced a sense of sort of existential rupture and a quest for healing and kind of, rehabilitating the memory of that empire. And I just wonder if you find traces of that in your archival materials.
Well, it's a really good question. I think in terms of outright nostalgia, nothing comes to mind. I mean, I think, part of it is the rhetoric itself, is that it comes to a certain point where the language of the reports become less colloquial, more formulaic in addressing senior leaders. Okay, so I mean that doesn't leave a lot of room for nostalgia. The other element of it too is that within these specific files, the tasker is really about the effectiveness of government. And so that also in itself doesn't leave a lot of room for nostalgia, since especially the old order, the imperial order, is singularly associated with a whole host of different negatives. Decay, the fact that the administration was anti-modern, was resistant to, that old local leaders were resistant to centralized rule. And so that doesn't leave a lot of, again, sort of room for nostalgia. It actually, if anything, it affirms what, is a, a kind of an internal bias that anything associated with the old regime has to be kind of bad, or somewhat suspect. And at times it leads to, kind of traces of internal contradiction. And I'll give you a quick example. So in Marash, in the south of the country, inspector finds that lots of local sort of notables, peoples of note, are kind of uncomfortable with the secularizing reforms. And among them are the so-called mujahids. These are the fighters who fought on Ataturk's behalf during the War of Independence. Now, these are individuals who claim to be the utmost patriots, but are deeply disturbed by, for example, the degree to which women are encouraged not to veil. They don't like the hat law. These are kinds of, so on the one hand, these are individuals who actually represent a more appropriate nostalgia, the nostalgia for the War of Independence, which I guess comes from the Ottoman period to some degree, but also represents obviously a clear blockage. Now, I'll just say sort of lastly that if you want to find evidence of a certain degree of nostalgia, you find it in the press, and you find it in a lot of the serialized testimonials that are printed in the press of people's memories from the from specifically the Young Turk period. I mean, you find sort of serialized biographies or autobiographies or memoirs from former senior leaders of the CUP, in which they talk, in some degree, somewhat nostalgically about the past. But that's the only thing that kind of comes to mind right now. Thank you, though.
Armin Marshubian?
Yes, thank you for fascinating talk and a rich window into a period that and a place that we don't often see. But when you're dealing with these official inspectorate reports, when one is writing a report, of course, one is cognizant of who you're writing the report to.
Right.
That results in a certain kind of language, as you point out, and it results in a certain view of the experience. I mean, of the information that's pushed up.
Right.
So if this is part of a larger project where actually you will look at memoirs and documents from the people that the inspectors are reviewing,
right?
That would give a different take on the periphery and the central state.
Right.
And related to that is, of course, the question of the goal of developing this mass party. Clearly, what the inspectors are finding is a very stratified society, which is the old Ottoman society, and possibly a satisfaction with that stratification in the interior that is clearly not there in what the inspectors write in their reports. And I'm thinking of that one in particular about Sivas and the sort of very strong language about the parasitic nature of these peddlers and craftsmen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we are somewhat akin to early Soviet, history. We really strain to find firsthand accounts, especially from the provinces. And so, this is sort of, in a lot of ways, this is almost all we have for, large parts of the country. And so, I mean, one could wish that you could, kind of find the other, kind of assume the other perspective. And to some degree, kind of there are counter memoir, there are memoirs that do give some degree of that, of the shoe being on the other foot, of being the one observed. But but considering the complexity of Anatolia, considering the complexity of Turkey, we're really kind of starving for this kind of insight. And so, conceivably, I mean, and I have to say, I drew a lot of inspiration from, you know, my time in University of Toronto and studying under Lynn Viola, who looked at peasants in, you know, in Stalinist Russia, and that in some ways these reports, you know, do give us some degree of insight if you read, quote unquote, against the grain, if you kind of give a sense of, if you can kind of get a more collective sense of patterns of behavior as kind of representative of response. A problem is we don't, that the insights are so episodic, right? There isn't, you know, you have large chunks of the country which are not surveyed by the inspectors during the 1930s, where basically the party doesn't exist. And we also, you know, even in places where we do get surveys, we don't necessarily get any of these kinds of anecdotes. So we don't have enough material to sort of give a sense of context or kind of draw broader conclusions. Now, some of my colleagues, again, I sort of mentioned individuals like Yiğit Akın and Murat Metinsoy, who have done, you know, taken a similar approach to these files, and specifically looking at petitions. And petitions, you do get a better sense of things like language and concern and so on. But in terms of trying to, let's say, kind of a Turkey-wide approach, in a lot of ways it's hard. Now, to your second question, in terms of sort of the party and developing a mass party, this is something I sort of struggle with, and I don't know if I can say really confidently how the officials thought about developing the party as a mass party. I mean, I think that a lot of, you know, like lots of mass parties, what we do know about the RPP is that membership was relatively low. That, you know, on average, I didn't do a kind of broader survey of this, but just sort of the examples I pull out in the book, you know, if you had a province where 10% of the population were members of the RPP, that was a lot. You know, oftentimes it was a lot lower than that, including a place like Istanbul, where the RPP had, for a long time, really negative connotation. In fact, you know, there was a lot of bitterness about the government moving from Istanbul to Ankara. Were they satisfied with the stratification? In fact, it was a big it was seen as an institutional problem, in that, you know, one of the things that really concerned the party was its ability to reach out to young people and to combat, you know, certain obstacles to broaden the party's appeal and broader, you know, sort of, and soften the ground for the party's message. And this is not only sort of the kind of institutions I've talked about in this talk, but things like, you know, there was women, for example, were seen as particularly problematic in the provinces, and that women posed were among the more sort of resistant to cultural reform. And so I don't know necessarily there was a lot of gratification from it. They understood it, that it was a genuine problem and that one that had to be overcome.
We have a few questions lined up. I'm gonna follow the order of appearance. Jim, let's continue with you.
Hi, thanks so much, Ryan. It's great to see you, at least virtually. It would be great.
I know, it's amazing.
So I want to say I really appreciate the way you frame revolution as a kind of almost sentimentality or mindset that the people carrying out all of these acts had. And I have a question kind of related to that kind of thinking, or that mode of thinking, as it relates to these changes that are happening in 1930, particularly with the collapse of the Free Party experiment. To me, it's very telling that so much of the opposition that is deemed problematic in that period, and then as you show in terms of the resistance that comes later on in the 1930s, it is identified as like ideational, right? It's these people are reactionaries. They don't understand themselves as Turkish. They're non-Muslim, etc. And it doesn't address structure at all. How exactly these people came to be organized in any kind of way. And that's surprising to me, because I've done a little bit of research on the Free Party, and one thing I found was how surprisingly fast, they were able to institutionalize themselves in, I mean, the party existed for 99 days, and yet they had, you know, branches and members and all of these things signed up in almost every province, like practically overnight, and had seemed to have like pretty strong connections to existing institutions like the Turkish Hearths and other local organizations. So it's surprising to me that the RPP officials were not, it seems, questioning the kinds of structures that gave rise to fast and well-organized opposition under the SCF and then later. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
I defer to you, because you are, you know, far more expert, having actually looked at the Free Party papers. And so I don't have a lot of sort of, I don't have a lot of personal insight into it. You know, the one thing I would say is that, you know, Zerker's treatment of the Progressive Republican Party shows something somewhat similar, and that there is, you know, even, you know, a relatively brief window in this party exists, and yet, you know, there is a kind of rapid set of rapid set of signs that it's beginning to organize into provincial offices and so on. And, you know, you could maybe chalk that up to, you know, the fact that we're talking about a party that is still somewhat kind of a reconstituted CUP, you know, to some degree, where the Free Party, we're now talking about a party that, you know, basically, you know, is, you know, comes to life 12 years after the CUP, you know, is dissolved, and doesn't really seem to bear any resemblance to the CUP. You know, the only thing I would sort of offer up is that, you know, the ways in which the party also comes together is so personalistic in some ways that, you know, that's sort of always my fallback, that there's so much of what happens is about the ways in which key individuals within, let's say, the provinces are interconnected, and then, you know, are able to kind of quickly form something like the skeleton of an organization. I mean, this is like, this is what I would say the thing that I've looked at most with respect to, say, the national forces in 1919, is that national forces come together really quickly. And it's in and beyond the fact that it's a reconstituted, you know, Ottoman army. It's done through all these different informal ways. And so I guess it does speak to sort of the richness of personal politics and of network politics. That's, otherwise, you're the man to answer that question better than me, you know.
You're too flattering. I was just curious how the RPP was seeing this, you know, at the same time. But yeah, that again, it's personalistic.
I mean, but in terms of, I mean, the one anecdote that comes to mind that I talk about in the book, that where they see some degree of conspiracy, and it's, you know, or sort of perceive a conspiracy, and one that they believe, is the connections between immigrants from Crete, right? And that immigrants from Crete are seen as really, you know, kind of a really problematic group, as kind of a quote unquote reactionary group, the fact that they speak Greek and that they're quite religious, and that they're spread out throughout the West, and that there seem to be also quite interconnected. And they talk about sort of Greek, you know, immigrants, you know, people of, I don't want to say Crete, I always hate saying Cretan, it sounds negative, but how these people, you know, from Crete, those who are, you know, merchants, travel from different places to place and then kind of connect amongst themselves. That's sort of where, that's one of the examples I can think of.
Okay, Leila.
Thank you very much for this this presentation, Ryan. I had a question about something that you mentioned earlier about the diversity of Turkey at this early interwar period, and how it was actually challenging the Turkish national identity. So my question is actually two parts. So what, how stable this idea of Turkish national identity, how we know of the sort of pre-Turkish Republic Turkish nationalist ideology and all of this stuff, but how much of it was actually part of the initial idea, and how much this diversity and the continuously coming hundreds and thousands of people, of immigrants who were not Turkish, obviously, helped form this idea of what Turkish national identity is? Thank you.
I mean, so you're asking is like, what degree is Turkishness being built from the ground up as opposed from the top down? Is that?
Both. I mean, there's all these people coming in, and then the government obviously has to deal with what they have at hand, what the situation is on the ground. There's all these people who don't speak the language, who come from very different parts. Yes, all they have in common is being Muslim, but that's a very different understanding of identity, you know, depending on migrants. So, yeah. I mean, it depends. I mean, from the top down part, you know, there's a way. I mean, I could go on and on about this. Is that you could talk about sort of the public rhetoric and then the internal, you know, the internal dialogue on the question. I mean, in terms of public, you know, that between, you know, you could bracket it off in the beginning, some, you know, at various places, but let's just say by the time the Sultanate is dissolved in, you know, the fall of 1922, there is a growing consensus within the sort of the beginnings of the Republican People's Party about what Turkishness is, in the sense of it being isolated around obviously religion, language, but increasingly a kind of a racialized, ethnicized idea. And I would sort of emphasize the racial element too, because these are individuals, intellectuals who are, you know, like lots of nationalists around the world at this time, quite fascinated by the kind of the biology of nationalism, right? Phrenology, all those kinds of things. So that it becomes more coherent as time progresses and much more institutionalized. And by 1938, I mean, there's lots of ways in which it becomes, you know, it's very much at the forefront of both domestic and even foreign policy, right? So, you know, the military actions in Dersim between 37 and 38, you know, the passage of the Dersim laws, in some ways is this, you know, effort, you know, to erect this Potemkin village of Turkishness in the middle of Alevi and Kurdish-speaking, you know, Anatolia. And then Hatay, or the so-called Hatay, is a kind of outward expression of it, you know, in which, you know, you had individuals like Fuad Kupurlu, who is, you know, both an RPP official and then this luminary in Turkish history, who will write articles about how, you know, the province of Alexandretta in Syria, you know, is kind of the embodiment of Turkishness in cultural sense, in a historical sense, in a racial sense, and so on. So that's one part of the story. And there's another side of the story internally within the elite where they're a little bit more frank, right? And they're a little bit more sort of understanding that not only of the realities of opposition, but the realities of the vibrancy of kind of derivations of Turkish identity, you know, and this is where the example of the Circassian guy, I think, kind of represents that. They can sort of say that this guy is Turkish, right? And he's a revolutionary, but he's doing it wrong, right? He's messing it up in a really fundamental way in, you know, identifying himself as being Circassian, right? And I should mention, comes at a time in which it becomes illegal. It is functionally illegal to identify yourself as being something other than non-Turkish, right? The epithets, the use of ethnic epithets, which are very common in the Ottoman era, identifying yourself by your kind of linguistic or ethnic background, it's outlawed, and he's still doing it. So that's a problem. Now, if you want to talk about the bottom-up part, I mean, very briefly, you know, you mentioned the question of migrants. The migrants are among the biggest challenges because so many of them, you know, have been signs of non-Turkishness, you know, including the ones that come from Greece, you know, between, you know, 1923 to 1925. You know, there's lots of evidence that suggests that the majority of them don't speak Turkish. And in fact, you know, they are in large places totally rejected by local communities.
and they're treated in really pejorative ways. And this is actually, there's been a lot of anthropological studies to the degree to which, these communities work really hard to integrate, but also try to retain some element of distinction. Okay, so it's a muddled story, and I would say it's also a muddled story, where with the big elephant in the room, which is with Kurds, right? In that there's an understanding from the outset that there are different types of Kurds. There's not just in terms of regionally and linguistically, but or things like tribe or something like that, but even there are Kurdish communities in Ankara that are native to Ankara. There are Kurdish communities, west of the Euphrates that are actually relatively integrated and that blur among the Turkish and even Arabic-speaking populations. And so that is a problem that, from the perspective of the state. And then we also see it, in signs from the ground up in terms of local leaders and local peoples who, take on elements of Kemalist ideology and reject others, and we can even see this among avowed Kurdish nationalists. I mean, Kurdish nationalism, as it's sort of defined, especially among Gurmanji speakers, is heavily influenced by Kemalism. The historical narrative, linguistic reform, all come out of the Kemalist revolution. So there is a lot of cross-fertilization, even among opponents, when it comes to Kemalism. I don't know if I necessarily addressed your question well, but I did my best.
I would like to turn to Candan Göksen'in. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
You hear me?
Yes, I hear you now.
Yes.
Okay, one thing is that probably I am one of your oldest participants at age 75. There are a couple of things I really would like to point out. One thing is that intellectually, RPP was poor because a lot of people who were not Ittihad ve Terakki did not join up, did not approve what was the system, did not join up RPP, number one. Second, if you look into the backgrounds of those people in Democrat Party, you will find a lot of them had not joined RPP and were not a part of it. So there you see a lot of the reasons why RPP was poor intellectually to some extent. As you have said before, there needs to be a lot of research done. Third, provincial prominent families, Istanbul prominent families who were near to the palace, to the imperial family, they have a lot of trove of documents at the bottom of their trunks. They are still afraid of bringing them out. Some of them are gone forever. And there we can see certain things to the background of what you are discussing. Why? There are a lot of memoirs or semi-memoirs of mutasarrifs, walis, who didn't join the party, but who were active in the 20s and 30s, who didn't also approve of Ittihad ve Terakki. So, but they were part of the bureaucracy. And there were some people, especially the bureaucracy, RPP, the bureaucracy that was the backbone of RPP. Some of the intellectuals had foreign wives, French, English, German. They were forced to resign. And a lot of these people stayed in the background, did not want to create problems. They did not even join the Democrat Party. So you are right, we need a lot more research. And anything that can come out from the bottom of trunks, if people are still afraid. I know quite a few of them.
Yeah.
They don't feel comfortable. Freud was right. You have, in order to be able to talk comfortably, you have to be comfortable. People are not comfortable. And those of us from all the Istanbul families, we know of this, a lot of them, although I caught the end bit of it. But this is something, if future research could bring light to all these things. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I agree with everything you were saying. I would add too that when it comes to resources, it is, it's often discussed that, Turkey has, opened its archives, has made a lot of progress in this regard. And to some degree, that's really true. In fact, I would say, to be fair, it's easier to work in the Ottoman archive than it is to work in the National Archive in Washington, D.C. It's better run. It's more, you can get a lot more done in Istanbul than you could ever do in D.C., at least in terms of the archive. The other, but there are lots of other things that are really kind of a mystery when it comes to the Republican era. I mean, I could go on and on. Many of, my colleagues here, I'm looking at you, James, could go on and on about many of the problems that are one has trying to sort of really find out what is available and what exists. And I think one of the things I would add solely to what you say is that I think there are a lot of people who are still really satisfied by the conventional history. There's not a tremendous appetite for revision among large segments of the population. Maybe in terms of certain tweaks, but on the whole, they're satisfied with it. And so I think if there was an actual, what I think would hopefully be even better is if people were actually begin to cultivate more curiosity and be willing to accept, revision of the history, but I'm pretty pessimistic on both counts.
We are coming close to the end of our allotted time, so we may take one or two more questions at most. Christos Paganos has been waiting for some time. We really appreciate if you could be really concise. That's Christos.
Who?
So hi, I'm sorry. This is Christos calling you from Copenhagen, Denmark, and thanks for being here today, Ryan. To make my question real fast, you gave an example of Abdul Qadir, the landowner, and basically he was, anti-secularist. He gave a speech, was really rewarded for doing that. And I guess when I think about revolution, that would be very expected in a way, that there would be a lot of people that were not as part of the process.
Right.
Norms are changing very quickly. It's hard to keep up with that. Look what happened after the French Revolution as an example, et cetera. And I guess my question is whether in your book you're trying to extrapolate what some of these, what you describe as episodic stories and anecdotes mean, because that's in a way, a risky thing to do, because there's a limited amount of information to try to extrapolate from. So I don't know, what are your views on that? Thank you.
So I sort of addressed that a little bit earlier with Armin's question, and that, I try to be somewhat conservative in talking about how, in terms of drawing broader conclusions from the ways in which people react to it. I think, the documents, and these documents unto themselves, provide glimpses, but they don't necessarily provide really a broad amount of material. And I'll sort of take this moment also to address Enes's question as well about the Diyanet, because it comes to this point too. A case like somebody like Abdul Qadir was arguably probably quite common, as you infer, Christos. But we don't really know, because one of the principal agencies that would have policed this, the Diyanet, we don't have access to their materials, right? I don't know if anybody actually has done any kind of work in the Diyanet in this regard. So it's hard to know. But still, here and there, I draw upon other people's work who have looked at sort of kind of broader trends, let's say, with respect to things like the people's houses and the effect that they have, or the degree to which the people's houses had struggles within provincial society. I think there you can sort of see some interesting trends. But you're right, you got to be somewhat careful.
Let us turn to Nilgün Anadolu Okur for the last question of the session.
Okay. I'm not sure if you can see me, but can you hear me?
I can hear you great.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Tunç, and thank you, Ryan. I'll be very quick. I know time is running. Now maybe you can see it. I was at the largest monitor. I took a few notes when you were presenting, and it's interesting to hear this perspective of yours. I think you were trying to mention the Kubilai incident when you were referring to 1930, who was beheaded.
Yes.
Because he was trying to stop the insurrection
yes.
led by the ultra-religious groups that belong to a tariqat. The second note and a question is, maybe you want to respond to this later on because we don't have much time, that you resembled RPP to Bolsheviks and fascists. You may need to clarify that, at least for me, because I was wondering, with some information I have about this issue, I said, how is he resembling this? It's interesting. Number three, very women's issue. You never mentioned women, excuse me, and women's rights, and you also said Atatürk was semi-retired in 1930s. I disagree a little bit with you, because in 1934, when they had the elections, this law gave women the right to be elected, and in 1935 we have 18 deputies elected to the National Assembly, which is, I think, an interesting point, and we should mention this. A semi-retired leader wouldn't really care if women got anything, but I think he did care for this. I agree with you about sentimental. No, not with you. I think it was Jim, who said it's a sentimental revolution with a question mark. I think all revolutions are sentimental because people are passionate and they care. But I disagree in the sense that I wouldn't use it as a negative term. I think it was very positive in terms of being a sentimental revolution.
Sure.
Turks and those people who lived on that land, including all the other minorities, Armenians and Kurds, there were many people who thought the same way. But I also want to ask this question, and this is the end of it. You used the term genocide, and you used it at least 4 times. So I'm asking you, is this not a risky term to use, because Turkish government is against this word? And this is a matter of international dispute for Turkey and Turks. So would you just respond to this right now, and then we will communicate? Thank you so much.
Okay. You packed a lot in there. I'm gonna do my best, Nilgün, to answer your question.
Thank you.
No, in reverse, yes, I think genocide is valid. I think it's the absolute consensus among scholars, in spite of what the Turkish government says. I could go on and on about it. In fact, if you'd like, I've written an article for War on the Rocks. If you just look up my name, you look up War on the Rocks, I've give you a broader sense of what my ideas are about this.
I'm aware.
Okay, I'm an easy guy to find on the internet. War on the Rocks, Ryan Gingeras. Anyway, going back about the revolution, I agree with you that people did take it seriously. I don't use it as I wouldn't necessarily use sentimentality as a pejorative. In fact, I called, as I explained in sort of the beginning of the book, I called the book Eternal Dawn as a kind of homage to the national anthem, and that the dawn will be eternal. The flag is eternal in the dawn, right? And that, I think, underscores, to me, the degree to which has appeared that is forward-thinking, that is positive, and is constructive, right? But I want to emphasize too, as I do in the here today, that there's another side to it which is very destructive, and that is also where there are limits. And that's really what the book is about, is trying to understand it, for its many facets. So, I mean, there's that. you asked about Kublai. Yes, that's I was asking. That was referencing that's the Menemen incident, the killing of Kublai. The second question you asked was about
women.
Women. Thank you. So yes, I do address women in the book, and about sort of in the question of Ataturk's relationship to it and being semi-retired. Really briefly, you know, it's clear that, you know, Ataturk made interventions into matters of state after 1930 that were selective. And among them was the issue of granting women the right to vote and for women to hold office. And this was very carefully stage managed by state officials. But for the most part, Ataturk, you know, was very much divorced from his day-to-day activities for much of the 1930s. It was much more drawn into things like researching and debating issues related to language and history. And we know this because we have a good sense of what his to some degree of what his day-to-day activities are during the 30s. Broadly, though, I mean, what I would say about, you know, women and the issue of, you know, kind of this, the relationship to, you know, women, the state, society, and so on, is that, you know, it is clear that, you know, on the one hand, the officials saw, you know, the granting of suffrage, allowing women to hold office, as important for both the revolution, but also international recognition. But there was also something deeply quite conservative about the way in which the RPP approached the issue of women, for example, with matters related to dress. But especially, you know, there was a lot of sort of suspicion about, you know, whether it's, you know, looking too Western or kind of behaving in ways which were deemed too Western or was deemed somewhat difficult. And there's also a degree to which, you know, issues matter related to family were left unaddressed by the RPP. So, I mean, I could kind of go on about what, you know, the politics of women mean to the RPP, but I think we have to recognize that both for the degree to which it advanced, you know, issues related to women, but also the degree to which, you know, there were also internal struggles over what that meant.
Thank you. I appreciate
No, thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Now we come to the end of our allotted time. Thank you so much for your attention and your excellent questions. I'm sorry for not being able to give you the platform to raise your questions personally. Before we close out, please feel free to post your questions if there are any on chat box, and I'm sure Professor Gingeras will entertain them after our session. And I would like to extend my thanks to Professor Gingeras for this extremely interesting talk. And I'm giving the podium to Holger Klein. Yeah.
Thank you, Tunç, and thank you, Ryan, and thank you all in the audience for participating so vigorously in the discussion after a very fascinating and stimulating talk. I am saying thank you to all of you for attending, and thank you in particular to Ryan for spending the last hour and a half with us. And I hope to see you again soon to one of our next programs. We will use the email and listserv to notify you. We have an event coming up in early December. We are working on scheduling, finalizing the schedule for some events in November. And January is already on our horizon. So we will be in touch with all of you, and we hope you will join us for another discussion or event in the future. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to all of you for joining us from everywhere in the world. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tunç. Good afternoon. Bye.